Hello. Now, if you remember, ladies and gentlemen, I made a rather bold statement at the end of the last lecture. I said that the Glorious Revolution of 1688 provided the capstone, a sort of culmination, as it were, of the constitutional history of England and informed what was to become, shortly thereafter, Great Britain and that difficult-to-define entity still known, despite those who were disunited, as the United Kingdom. When one makes such bold statements, as I have a tendency to do, as you well know, one is required to back them up with those pesky little things called facts. So, what are the facts about the Glorious Revolution that made it so remarkable? Why is it that one can still say with considerable confidence that the removal of the Catholic James II and his replacement with his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange form the constitutional matrix from which the modern British state emerged, thereby establishing a political settlement that persists to this day? Well, for one thing, the events that led to the Glorious Revolution and the constitutional arrangements that followed it were determined not by the people or the monarchy, not by the church or the army, but by Parliament. At a time when kings were considered answerable to no one but God, this was indeed a revolutionary moment. Furthermore, it involved using the threat of violence to force a legitimate king to vacate his throne and be replaced by his daughter, who, since the birth of James's son in June 1688, was only second in the line of succession. It is often overlooked that when William of Orange invaded England, he did so with a sizable army and a fleet of ships larger than the Spanish Armada. And yet, of course, he had been invited to invade by a prominent faction within England's political establishment, mostly but not exclusively Whigs, who enjoyed widespread support among many sections of the population. In fact, the Glorious Revolution represented nothing less than a transfer of ultimate sovereignty from the Crown to Parliament. But those who controlled Parliament had no intention of allowing William and his English wife to rule as absolutists. In order to sit on the English throne and to remain seated, they would have to agree to abide by the will of Parliament. This they reluctantly agreed to do, although it was something no English monarch had done before. Prior to being offered the crown, they had been shown a document called the Declaration of Rights that placed serious restrictions on the exercise of royal power. Elements of that document were later enshrined in the English Bill of Rights of 1689, to which William and Mary assented, as they were constitutionally obliged to do, and to which they added their signatures, as they were also required to do, in order for it to become the law of the land. Now, for anyone acquainted with the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution, there is much they would find familiar in its English predecessor. For example, there is a provision against cruel and unusual punishments and excessive bails that finds its way virtually verbatim into the Eighth Amendment of the US Bill of Rights. Similarly, there is a provision forbidding royal interference in the right of people to bear arms, to defend themselves, that foreshadows the Second Amendment, as there is one prohibiting the quartering of soldiers in people's homes, thereby anticipating the Third Amendment. But there is also much that an American who knows his Bill of Rights, as every American should, would find unfamiliar. While he would not be surprised to find basic rights like the freedom to petition government without fear of reprisal, and no arbitrary taxes without the consent of Parliament, he might be surprised to discover no right of religious liberty and a guarantee of freedom of speech that applies only to parliamentary debates. Also, despite affording rights to Protestants not affiliated with the established Church of England, so-called nonconformists, Catholics were denied those rights that I think the framers of the American Constitution took for granted. Indeed, Catholics were specifically excluded from the rights and protections afforded Protestants, not being permitted to bear arms, for example. They were also barred from Parliament and other areas of public life. In fact, Anglicans were clearly favoured. The Church of England was given a privileged position in English life. Moreover, Catholics were expressly forbidden from sitting on the throne, as, to quote the Bill of Rights, "It hath been found by experience that it is inconsistent with the safety and welfare of this Protestant kingdom to be governed by a popish prince." At their coronation, William and Mary were required to pledge to maintain the true profession of the gospel and the Protestant Reformed religion established by law. Nevertheless, despite its attempts to exclude Roman Catholics from the mainstream of English life, the Bill of Rights established the principle that freeborn Englishmen possessed inalienable rights and that no one, however exalted or powerful, was above the law. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not something to be sneezed at. To justify their actions, the men who brought about this usurpation of power and removal of a legitimate king had one of the best minds of the day at their disposal, the Whig philosopher John Locke. Indeed, it was Locke who supplied the most elegant and enduring rationalization of what was, lest we forget, an illegal act. In his two treatises of civil government, he expands upon ideas about the state of nature and the social contract, first fully articulated by Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan. However, for Locke, the state of nature was not the war of all against all as it was for Hobbes. Furthermore, rather than being slaves to their passions, especially their urge to dominate others and fear of violent death, men are also driven by reason and the desire to cooperate with their fellows. Although in the state of nature they enjoyed equality and the natural rights to life, health, liberty, or possessions, they formed civil society in order to settle disputes and better protect their property. Having formed a social contract with a ruler, they are nonetheless permitted to remove that ruler if he fails to protect their interests. Indeed, if he showed signs of becoming a tyrant, they were duty-bound to do so. Small wonder, then, that when the founding fathers of the United States wanted to rationalize their rebellion against George III, they needed to look no further than the elegant writings of John Locke. But what of events subsequent to the Glorious Revolution? I hear some of you asking. Well, we already saw what happened to poor old James II when he tried to regain his crown. He and his Irish Catholic supporters were soundly defeated at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, leaving, incidentally, a legacy of antagonism between Catholic and Protestant Irishmen that continues to this day. James died in French exile in 1701, although his son and grandson, as we've seen, continued the by now lost Jacobite cause. That year also saw the Act of Settlement passed by the English to permanently exclude the children James had had with Mary of Modena from the line of succession. It called instead for the crown to pass from the two Protestant daughters that James II had had with his first wife, the long-dead Anne Hyde, who, ironically enough, had been received into the Catholic Church on her deathbed. By the time James II died, a pensioner of his cousin Louis XIV, his oldest daughter Mary, Queen of England, had also died. She predeceased her husband William in 1694, inspiring England's greatest composer, Henry Purcell, to write some of his most moving music for her funeral. William lived on, embroiling his adopted country in expensive wars against his longtime foe, Louis XIV. He never remarried, and his marriage to Mary had produced no children. Thus, when he died in 1702, he was succeeded by his sister-in-law, Anne, James II's youngest daughter, from his marriage to Anne Hyde. Married to Prince George of Denmark, an affable nonentity but devoted husband who happily played second fiddle to his wife, Anne gave birth to 17 children, but not one of them was alive at the time of her death in 1714. As called for in the Act of Settlement, she was succeeded by George, the Elector of Hanover, a great-grandson of James I. Now, during the reign of Queen Anne, England united with Scotland in the 1707 Act of Union to form the new nation of Great Britain. It was also during the reign of this last of the Stuarts that England, now Great Britain, experienced some of her greatest triumphs as a result of her participation in the War of the Spanish Succession. With the accession of George I, Great Britain entered a period of considerable stability in which she acquired the largest empire since Rome and became the first nation to industrialize. But perhaps her greatest achievement was to do something no other nation had done before: establish a constitutional monarchy in which the monarch was not above the law but subject to it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.